Hey everybody, happy Monday. Don't worry about the makeup. I'm doing if you think I look like kind of intense and spooky, it's because I'm doing makeup tests for boss fight, trying to get the different characters worked out so they look different. So this is designed to sort of make my eyes look closer together. So you're not imagining that. Don't worry. This is not a permanent change. It's for a character. That's what I do. I do makeup tests for characters, like subtle, like the subtle technique, not necessarily the colors, but just the techniques, and then I use them on videos and go, how did it look on video? Okay, that had the desired effect, because how something looks on camera and how something looks in on your face isn't always the same. I have learned that the hard way. So this is how I do it. And this is going to be pre-recorded. So if something changes radically from Saturday night, I apologize. I had a show in Collingwood last night. So I had to pre-record a live show. Thank you to those who showed up. Americans, if you don't know where Collingwood, Ontario is, don't worry about it. And since you weren't at the live show, you can support me in other ways. I will soon have t-shirts on the FU network thing. Not yet, but soon. But also, you can support me on Patreon. You should become a member. Patreon.com/LeannaK. Thank you to those of you who have showed up. The song is working. There's been a nice little bump. That and the fact I keep getting demonetized, and I appreciate the support from people who that pisses off. I also have a new podcast that the only money I'm getting from it right now is Patreon support. It's called Level with Her. It is on the FU network. I'll put a link in the description box. It is a series of Inside the Actors studio style, long form interviews with game developers. The more historical, the better as far as I'm concerned, but I'm not setting limits on it because I'm only going to do them when I can actually get an interview. But the kickoff one is with Lori Cole of Quest for Glory fame. Quest for Glory turns 30 this month. There's a hashtag going on called Quest for #4 Glory 30. Online. The series debuted in October 1989. So, yeah, as I say to Lori in the podcast, what's it like to have a game who's old enough to have gone through college and grad school? That's a hell of an achievement. And the fact that she's still working in the business is amazing. And she's also got a crowdfund going on right now. So if you can kick her a few bucks, I'm sure she'd appreciate it. Really, really interesting interview. Really amazing insights. It's always really cool when you get an introvert talking about their passion because awesome things happen. But I am going to talk today about something that's not terribly awesome. After that 2.5 minutes of business, because I need to make money too. What I want to talk today is what the heck is going on with Activision? You don't get worse weeks as a company than Activision had last week. This is why I'm saying that, something may have changed because the stories, the two-pronged story, one with all this Hearthstone, Hong Kong, China, Blitzchung rot, more on that in a bit. Hold that thought. But also, I won't call it a rumor because there's screenshots. There's graphics, but I'm not sure if they're real. But there is a theory that Bobby Kotick was in Jeffrey Epstein's little black book. Now, Activision Blizzard is so hated at the moment, I wouldn't put it past someone to forge that, which is why I'm being very careful about it. But oh my God, I mean, the very thought of that is yikes. I have no way of confirming what I saw, which is why I'm being very, very super careful. So let's deal with what's going on with Activision. I touched on this very late Friday, so I'm going to go through it again, just in case some of you missed it. A competitive Hearthstone player who goes by, Blitzchung, supported, in a shoutcast, supported the Hong Kong protesters, which, by American standards, no big deal, right? Well, it was a competition in Taiwan. The location is extremely important because Taiwan is an occupied state. There's been like tensions with Taiwan my entire life. I remember it was a big deal when things were made in Taiwan because it was this, the US government speaking out against China by actually saying things were made in Taiwan instead of China because Taiwan considers itself its own thing. China considers Taiwan a part of China. So it's contentious, and that's since been reversed. So the fact that it's in Taiwan is very important. People from Taiwan who have a Taiwanese background, are going to be sympathetic to Hong Kong because China's stepping on their necks too. But in response to him just expressing an opinion, which is one of those things that it is in violation of a very vaguely written rule that could mean anything. But Blitzchung was stripped of his prize money and barred from competition for a year. And the general consensus was that was way too harsh. Activision Blizzard subsequently reduced the punishment to no docking of prize money and a 6-month suspension. I still think that's way too harsh. It should be a 1-game suspension for a first offense. If he does it again, fine. But a first offense? No, man. That's excessive. These are young people. Young people are passionate. These things are important to them. They forget themselves. 6 months is ridiculous. What does that teach them? Like, seriously, what does that teach them? The Activision Blizzard has been accused of compromising its of prioritizing its relationship with China over protecting free speech. Activision Blizzard has denied that. The reason this is important because Tencent, the Chinese gaming company, has, I believe, a 10% stake in Activision. Now, BlizzCon's coming up November 1st, and this whole controversy shows no sign of calming down. And activist groups are announcing they're going to protest BlizzCon in Anaheim. Interesting times. Now, this is not what's going on in Syria with Turkey and the Kurds, okay? In terms of importance in the world, I am not saying this is the most important thing happening right now. It's just a gaming thing. So I am covering that instead of the stuff with Turkey and the Kurds, which has me very worried. But I want to talk about whether or not it makes sense that a 10% stake in Activision Blizzard could cause them to behave this way. I don't think it does. I think Activision Blizzard just shit the bed and acted stupid. I am a big believer in, don't think something is nefarious when it can be dismissed as pure stupidity. And I think that's what this is. I think somebody just panicked and did something dumb and overreacted, and then they couldn't totally walk back the overreaction, and so they got Streisand affected. The smartest thing they could have done is just backed right off. Like I said, given him a 1-game suspension for the first offense. He does it again, lower the boom on him, fine. But come on. This isn't going to encourage other players to do this. Nobody wants to get suspended. It's just there's too much money on the line with this stuff. And you sort of lose your momentum if you're out for a tournament. Momentum's a very real thing with competitors. So nobody's going to want to do that. A one match suspension would have been enough. This 6-month stuff, ridiculous. But there's two main reasons that I don't think the Tencent ownership stake is behind this. One, 10% of a company is not enough to be a controlling investor. 10% is basically you make money off the company. You've invested in it. They don't have enough ownership to control decisions. So that doesn't make a ton of sense. A company as big as Activision can lose a 10% investor and get it back very quickly. It is not crippling to lose 10% of, if they sell off their stock, whatever. And games in China are sold for pennies on the dollar. So I don't even think it's that. Back in the World of Warcraft days, Blizzard used China to artificially inflate their numbers. The Chinese servers went down, and we found out just how many of World of Warcraft's player base were Chinese players playing the game for pennies on the dollar back when WoW was a subscription game. Remember those days? That was the first article. No, that was the second article I ever wrote that got, people tried to cancel me before cancel culture was a thing. This was back in the day. But it was the first one that ended up on NeoGAF, and they decided they hated me back before they hated me for womaning wrong. I know, weird, right? But before that, the worst experiences I'd had was with Halo 3, to put it in perspective. Because I didn't think Halo 3 was a 10 out of 10. I gave it an 8 out of 10, so I needed to be destroyed. Gaming. But this Blizzard Activision thing, I don't think it's Chinese nefariousness. Because for all of China's, super villainy, mwahaha, we own you, China has its own debt problems. China has a massive debt to GDP ratio that dwarfs even the 120 something percent debt to GDP ratio America has. That means that the US debt of any given year is 120 something percent of its gross domestic product in a given year. Well, China's is over 300%. Its debt is 300% of its gross domestic product. That basically means that if China were to default, they would not be able, if somebody called their debt, China would not be able to pay it. And, smaller economies, when they get into that much trouble, they end up having to get a bailout from the World Bank. And, they're subjected to very severe austerity measures, which is, what led to the riots in Ecuador right now. I know this is very geopolitical. What can I say? I read a lot. But Tencent or any other Chinese investor is not going to leave money on the table, precisely because the only way a country stays ahead of a 300% debt to GDP ratio is to continue to make money and continue to grow their GDP. This is actually what's happening in Canada right now, or might happen depending on who gets elected. It's totally even odds right now. It's total toss up. But the Liberals' financial plan, which has been costed and seen to be mostly okay by the Parliamentary Budget Office, which is, a nonpartisan third-party government organization that costs government plans. Canada's debt to GDP ratio is 30%, just over 30%. People are still screaming about deficits up here. We don't have a debt problem. We're fine. That's why we can afford to spend, but people are still howling about debt. But the whole idea of a lot of the economic plans is that, yes, they will continue to run deficits, but GDP will grow faster than the debt grows. Therefore, the debt to GDP ratio, which a country's credit rating is partially based on, is still good because you're making enough money to pay your bills. That's how it works. A 300% plus debt to GDP ratio is not healthy no matter who you are. But China is just such a massive economy, people are letting them get away with it because they have 6% growth, 6 to 7% growth in a given year. This is why I'm saying that Chinese companies, for all their public-facing, no, we stand up for China and the party, cannot afford to leave money on the table in anything. Chinese businessmen are like any other businessman in the world. They want to make money first, everything else second. So I don't think that's it for both those two reasons. Not enough of a stake in the company to have control over these things. And also, they need the money. They need to keep making money so that their debt that the entire country is accumulating doesn't cripple them. So, what is it then if it's not direct Chinese interference? That doesn't mean that Activision Blizzard itself, the American side of the equation, didn't knee-jerk over the Chinese market. Because the gamble that most conventional companies are making on China's do whatever you can to get into the Chinese market because there's just so many people. Same deal as India. The problem with the Hong Kong protests right now is, depending how that shakes out, China could look very different in a couple of years. And if the protesters win, they're going to remember who backed them and who didn't. So the entire business landscape of China could change radically. Obviously, that is something of a long shot, but at this point, it is possible because the Hong Kong protests have been far more determined than I think anybody expected. So, what have we got going on here? We've got an American company who, I think Activision Blizzard at this point has surpassed EA as the most hated gaming company out there. I know, right? Now, it's because of this annualized business model they've had for about 10 years now. Activision likes likes IPs. They like game franchises that they can put out content, just push out content year after year after year after year. They don't have to spend a ton on marketing because you have that, inherent player base that will just buy the games over and over and over, buy the new content for the games. There's a Call of Duty game every year. For a while, there was a Skylanders game every year. Bungie parted ways with Activision on Destiny because they wanted too many kind of garbage microtransactions and they wanted to milk it as a cash cow too much. It's called a narrow and deep business model, meaning they have very few titles, but each one of them makes a lot of profit. They don't like speculation, which is why I say they're now below EA in terms of goodwill, because every so often EA will take a risk on something and put out a legitimately charming game, like Unraveled or A Way Out, or Unravel, not Unraveled, or A Way Out or something like that. Every so often, EA puts out an original game that is cool. Activision doesn't do that nearly as often. It's 4 to 5 franchises at any given time that just, they're reliable. They can predict how much money they're going to make, and so they just slowly squeeze the cost on each franchise and make more and more profit from it. There's a reason they put so much money out front on it. And this is generally not preferred by hardcore gamers who want innovation. Activision Blizzard is not exactly an example of a very innovative company. Now, Hearthstone is a weird one. Hearthstone was almost like an accidental Activision brand, much like Skylanders didn't quite fit, right? it's this free to play digital collectible card game based on like the Warcraft IP that has become this huge thing. It's basically Magic the Gathering, only totally digital. And I think it's free to play model mixed with the fact that it's a well balanced collectible card game. It's really taken off. It's built in Unity. It's just one of these weird little games. And so I think that Activision Blizzard didn't recognize, even though it's a Blizzard game, like Blizzard Entertainment, the developer side a game, they didn't realize you can't milk that sort of thing for cash the way you can with, say, Call of Duty. There's a different relationship that the community has with the game because it's just one of those games that nobody could have predicted the success of it. And this is where Activision got into trouble. When you have this model, and this is the case for any big company, when you have this model, this very rigid model about how you run your company, and you get this kooky little hit, you're not sure what to do with it. And so they made the same mistake with Skylanders. Skylanders was a great idea. It was charming. It was interesting. And so they just milked it to death. And so Hearthstone, it's harder to do because parents aren't running around buying these little physical figures, and eventually it's like, too many. It's digital, right? And so people aren't as aware of how much they've actually put into it because it's not crap accumulating in their house. But when you offend the goodwill of your community, you get into a lot of trouble, and you get into a lot of trouble fast. And that's what I think Activision did here. They thought they could just smack a player down the way the very aggressive, anti-harassment policies regarding online bullying and all that stuff have been done. They thought they could dole out this severe punishment like, they do for like hate speech in Call of Duty and get the exact same response. They didn't understand the nuance of the situation. And that is not a Chinese mistake. That is very much an American gaming company mistake. And I saw this when I used to be like a games journalist, like actually went down and covered things directly. I wasn't just sitting here doing opinion. I was actually going on and gathering news. During when the Xbox 360 was riding high, the Xbox guys, like the Xbox salespeople, the marketing people, were huge jerks to the PlayStation people. And the Nintendo people for an extent, but the head-to-head competition was between the Xbox 360 and the PS3. And you watch the PS3, the PlayStation people kind of you saw them be pissed. I'm not going to get into what was done, but yeah, it was petty. It was petty. Xbox was rubbing PlayStation's nose in it. And so you watch the PlayStation people go, we'll get you assholes. And they waited, and they bided their time. And on the PS4, Xbox One cycle, they crushed them. That's how Japanese companies work. PlayStation plays the long game. Sony plays the long game. I called the Marvel Sony thing with Spider-Man on the exact same reasons because I have watched this company work for over a decade. God, more than that. Going on 2 decades. Yikes. I've been doing this a long time. But I watch Sony play the long game again and again and again. And one of the things Sony has done is developed first-party IPs. They're not interested in making a ton on any single game. They want to win the console war in terms of the dominant console in the living room. And so they are willing to not make a ton of money on that console and not make a ton of money on each individual game. I'm not talking like gross totals. The games sell very well. I'm talking about profit margins because they're very expensive to make, and they're single player campaign. You play it for 60 hours and you're done kind of thing. You know, if God of War was only 60 hours, great game. But they are developing IPs and they are developing memorable characters that not only, if you see that great ad where they're like falling from the sky, like Kratos and Drake and a bunch of other guys, I want to go through because it happens so quickly. I'm not paying attention. It's all that, and I've missed the first 3 characters. I usually come in on like Drake, and then I'm like, oh, it's such a good ad. But the only reason it works is because Sony has so many characters right now that they own that are immediately recognizable. And, you know, if they want to, they can develop television properties. They can sell merchandise based on these characters. They can make movies based on these characters. That's hard to do with video games, but it's possible with some of these IPs because they're so cinematic. But Japanese companies play the long game like that. They diversify, so if any part of the business falters, they're okay. They don't have to be reactive and radically change their business practices. That's why the hardware side of Sony managed to stay a premium brand throughout the recession. They didn't have to drop their prices and reduce their quality the way some other companies did to stay afloat. American companies are different. American companies are the swagger, bravado, the Xbox side of that. And the issue with that is because they're so narrow and deep, because they're all in on the swagger, when they falter, it's panic time. And I think that fragility, if you will, was what caused the overreaction. Because in a lot of these companies, like, everybody's afraid of getting fired. The lack of job security in U.S. companies is not good for good decision making. Because I can guarantee in those shoutcasts and everything like that, it's one person freaked out, thought they were going to get fired, so they yelled at somebody else who thought they were going to get fired, who yelled at somebody else who thought they were going to get fired, and then somebody made a decision that was a gross overreaction. And that's what happened. It was one of these, never chalk up to kind of evil or nefariousness, what can be explained by sheer ineptitude or stupidity. I think that was it. It happened to be about China, and, some middle management person may have decided, like, oh my God, it's China, freak out. Or they just like, no, our rules say, because people who are insecure in positions of power love to say no. They love to be punitive with people. More on that in tomorrow's video. But it doesn't make for good decisions. Sometimes it's better to be easier on people because then you buy goodwill. People generally don't like to be told they've done something wrong. Usually, hey, that's against our rules, don't do that again, is enough. Because we're gamers. We like rules, right? We like to achieve fair, because that means we've achieved. We don't like to cheat. So, usually that one, just the caution, a 1-game suspension or whatever, like a slap on the wrist, is enough. Because people's reputations and integrity are enough to keep them on the straight and narrow. They didn't have to burn it with fire the way they did. It was a mistake. But it was a very American corporate overreaction. It doesn't seem to me like that Chinese choking the life out of people. The Chinese business is like a boa constrictor, And it may very well have been the mere threat of them pulling out their investment was enough to do it. But I don't think it was the direct pressure that the current theory is. Now, that doesn't mean that Chinese censorship didn't play a role. It's just China's gotten so good at stepping on the world's financial neck that executives or middle management in other countries are doing their dirty work for them. Crazy stuff, huh? Anyway, I will leave it there. That was a very long explanation. Hope you enjoyed it. Really deep dive. This is why I don't do games journalism more. I am a long form person. I need 8,000 word deep dives to do everything. This is why I've started a long form interview podcast, because this is what I do. Anyway, if you enjoyed this, Patreon, you should become a member. Patreon.com/Leanna K. Thanks so much for watching, and hopefully the story doesn't update too much in a day.